You're watching HLN On Demand.
Up next, a community reels after the senseless murder of a young woman.
It's very difficult to let a mom and a dad know that their daughter has been killed.
It was a horrendous tear in the fabric of her life.
The victim has no known enemies. Her murder defies explanation.
There was really no context for it. It was really a complete mystery.
Hundreds of suspects emerge, but for years, there are no arrests.
Nothing about this case was another day at the office. It was complex, it was challenging.
Ultimately, old-fashioned detective work and a little bit of art expose a killer hiding in plain sight.
Science was there from the beginning.
Most residents of Agawam, Massachusetts will tell you it's an ideal place to raise a family.
The community has always been great. Great schools, great activities for the kids. Warm place. Warm place with wonderful people.
The Ziegert family raised 3 girls and a boy in the town. Their second child, Lisa, was determined to follow in her parents' footsteps, and once married, planned to raise a family close to home.
She could have changed her mind, but she loved being close enough to be able to pop in and say, "Hey, Mom, can I borrow your shoes?" Or something like that. Or, "Can I do some wash?" I think she loved the closeness, yet the independence.
Lisa had a degree in education and was working as a teacher's aide. To make some extra money, she took a job at a card shop called Brittany's in a local strip mall.
She loved it because she loved people.
Lisa worked nights and weekends, and her hours meant she almost always worked alone. 4 days before Easter in 1992, she was working her usual 5 to 9 shift when a customer entered the store to find it empty, but with the door open and all the lights on. Police say the customer called out and got no answer. The next morning, a worker found the store unlocked. It hadn't been closed up from the night before.
At 9 a.m., the door was open, lights were on. Lisa's car was in the front, in the parking lot, and all of her personal belongings were still inside of Brittany's card shop.
Lisa was too responsible. She would have never left that store unsecured. She would have never left until 9 o'clock.
Officers searched.
There was boxes on the floor that had been obviously pressed down, like somebody had been on top of them. Slight blood spattering on some of those boxes. There was also blood spattering on a few of the greeting cards that were on a stand just outside the door to that particular closet or back room.
The signs were ominous. All that was missing from the store was Lisa. Investigators searched the surrounding area and found nothing.
Everyone had fingers crossed. The community would organize searches, for her. If you didn't live under a rock, everyone heard about the Lisa Ziegert disappearance.
There was never a time that they weren't out looking for her, searching for her, and we had faith that we would find her and she would be okay.
Days passed. Lisa's deeply Catholic family hoped for the best and prepared for the worst. Easter Sunday arrived, and still there was no sign of her.
We went to Mass at our church, where we attended every Sunday. The whole family and a large group of friends came with us to Mass. It was good to be there. It was good to be there. It was a peace.
But any hopes for Lisa's safe delivery were dashed a few hours later. Her body was found in a wooded area about 3 miles from the store where she was last seen.
I'm trying to think of the best way to say the word dead. And I got there and walked up, and Dee was waiting at the door. And I explained it to her and just went from there.
Wayne Macy, our wonderful, dear, wonderful friend, Wayne Macy, came to the door by himself. I went to the door and I looked at him and I said, just by his face, you found her, didn't you? And he went, yeah, we did. And I said, she's dead, isn't she?
The tragedy stunned this normally quiet, peaceful town, and as details of Lisa's murder emerged, outrage gave way to outright terror.
my 20 years of being a crime reporter, was one of the most savage, depraved, almost bestial assaults that I've covered.
Because she had clearly struggled for her life, the scene of Lisa Ziegert's murder was littered with evidence.
She was found partially clad. Her upper body clothes had been pulled down, and she had numerous stab wounds, the major one being across her neck.
Police had really a trove of information. Forensic material was found, spread out, maybe, by to work.
But no murder weapon, apparently a knife, was found. Even in 1992, investigators understood that genetic evidence from this scene and from Lisa's rape kit would be key. In Massachusetts, DNA evidence wasn't even admissible in court for years, but investigators knew that day was coming.
Even though we couldn't put a name to that DNA, we felt that eventually the individual that committed this crime, that his DNA would eventually match with the sample that we had.
In 1992, DNA criminal databases didn't even exist. So detectives turned to old-fashioned police work to expose who their DNA profile might belong to. First off, they had a rock-solid time frame for when Lisa was kidnapped from the card shop.
The last person in the store was there at 8:20. A purchase was made, and she left.
Another witness entered the store around 9 o'clock to find the lights on and no one there. So the abduction almost certainly happened within that 40-minute window. Another possible lead? A fresh set of tire tracks found near Lisa's body.
The officers made a mold of the tire tracks. We took those back to the lab to be analyzed. They were Cooper tires.
The combination of tires on this vehicle was so distinctive, detectives were able to comb through sales records at local dealerships and track down the driver of the vehicle.
We brought him in for questioning, and he went home and brought back with him pictures of that vehicle at the crime scene 3 days prior to Lisa being killed, where he was four-wheeling with his friends, and that particular lead turned out to be of no significance.
Another witness said they remembered seeing a Bronco SUV in the area where the body was found, around the time of Lisa's murder. This prompted a local woman to contact police.
A woman called and said, "My then boyfriend, who is ex-military, has a fixation with knives and has a Bronco, or a type of vehicle like that they were looking for. Moreover, he came home around the time of the murder, and there was blood on the inside of his truck, and the dashboard had been kicked in."
Detectives tracked him down. He said he'd sold the vehicle. To see if this was true, it was traced halfway around the world.
And it ended up going to New York City. And then from New York City, a car dealer there sold it to somebody in St. Petersburg, Russia.
European countries do a big business in four-wheel drive vehicles that are exported from our country.
Investigators in Massachusetts reached out to analysts overseas to have the SUV examined.
We got in touch with Interpol, and they went over the car as best they could.
Conventional approaches, even employing psychics and hypnotizing people, like this woman, who may have seen something connected to the murder.
Take a deep breath.
Investigators really turned over every stone and over the years tried every possible tactic.
But traditional and non-traditional methods turned up nothing. The case went cold, not for lack of evidence, but because no match could be made to the high-quality DNA profile from the crime scene. But a troubled marriage ended up solving that problem. To this day, nearly every long-term resident of Agawam, Massachusetts, remembers the shock of Lisa Ziegert's murder.
Lisa Ziegert's murder, abduction, and rape threw the entire town for a loop. Some of the young waitresses, their parents wouldn't let them go to work. There were gyms that were offering self-defense classes for women. It just completely preoccupied the town.
Anthony Gallooni, the area's future district attorney, who would help put the case on the front burner in 2016, vividly recalls how it affected the town.
So in 1992, around the time of Lisa's murder, I was 12 years old. Agawam was gripped by this awful tragedy that involved an innocent, beautiful, talented, intelligent young woman.
All this attention was both good news and bad news for investigators. Everyone wanted to help. Tips poured in. Some were viable, many were not.
These people actually thought they were helping us. So therefore, I think I know something. I'm gonna call the police. I'm gonna give them a tip. My cousin, my ex-boyfriend, my ex-father-in-law, whatever it may be.
In reviewing the files, detectives looked at, among many others, a tip from 1993. A woman said she was sure her ex-husband did it.
She was accusing him because he seemed to be preoccupied with the TV whenever the news would come on, and he would be watching it and talking about it with his friends all the time.
His name was Gary Sherrill. He still lived in Agawam, and when he heard that his ex-wife called police, he called them too.
He stated that he had heard from his wife and a number of other people that he was a suspect in the Lisa Ziegert homicide, and he wanted to know if that was true. And I told him I don't talk about those things on the phone, but I'd like to speak with him.
But on the advice of his lawyer, Shara stopped contact with police, and Shara's accuser had her own issues, which threw doubt on this tip.
Gary's wife was an alcoholic. She was depressed. Just so many things going on with her.
This turned out to be just one of hundreds of potential leads that went into a file that got bigger by the year.
At one point, women in gift and card shops in states including Virginia and Pennsylvania and I think Maryland, and they thought they had the guy. Because how many times are you going to get a serial rapist and kidnapper who focuses in on women who work in card shops?
No suspects panned out, but investigators still had their key piece of evidence. A full genetic profile of Lisa Ziegert's killer.
When this crime occurred in 1992, there was no such thing as a national DNA database or a local DNA database. Basically, this case spans the history of DNA testing.
The DNA profile was repeatedly entered into state, national, and even international databases, which grew larger and larger every year. Prosecutors estimated that worldwide, the DNA from the Ziegert case was tested against more than 16 million profiles, but still, no matches.
That led me to looking at people who may have died, somebody who never had to provide a DNA sample.
Or Lisa's killer could still be alive and never repeated this crime, something very unusual for a sexually motivated killer. No one had an explanation, and as the years ticked by, even the most optimistic investigators feared Lisa Ziegert's killer would never be brought to justice.
This was a particularly brutal and egregious crime. How could somebody commit a crime like this and have done it only once?
After more than 20 years, teams of detectives could not put a face to the DNA profile from Lisa Ziegert's murder.
It was frustrating, frightening. I worried for my other children, of course. That's your first concern. You have 2 other daughters. You worried for them.
With nothing panning out, investigators turned to a newly developed, cutting-edge way to use DNA, developed by a company called Parabon Nanolabs. These forensic pioneers harnessed the power of computers to the vast DNA databases growing worldwide. They've developed a program they call Snapshot.
We think of Snapshot as a genetic witness, so it's essentially stepping in when there isn't a human witness to give the detective a description.
Snapshot isolates a host of observable genetic characteristics called phenotypes, things like ethnicity, even hair and eye color.
The phenotype is just a trait, so a person's eye color phenotype could be blue or something like that. So we have an unknown person, we have their DNA, can we predict what their eye color should be based on their DNA?
The problem in this case was that so much time had passed, and it's here that science and art came together.
Age is not. We do have a forensic artist on staff, a certified forensic artist.
Parabon released 2 images. The first approximated what Lisa's killer looked like in 1992. The second was a forensic artist's educated guess at what he'd look like more than 20 years later.
It really proved to be, I think, a turning point for our case. It was also a turning point in the forensic history of the case.
One suspect on the narrowed down list of suspects was Gary Shera. He was one of 11 men, all of whom, for a variety of reasons, refused to surrender any genetic material.
We are not allowed to force somebody to give us their DNA. It's their constitutional right to refuse it. Gary Shera actually told me that he was afraid of cloning. He was adamant he refused to give us his DNA.
Gary Shera also seemed well aware of the power of DNA evidence. In 2008, detectives recorded their third encounter with him.
He stayed a noticeable difference away from the table, wouldn't put his hands on the table, wouldn't take a drink out of the bottled water they provided for him.
Did you have any kind of memorabilia or anything like that, newspaper articles or anything about Lisa's murder? Will really read newspapers even today? I just scan the headlines and maybe the sports page.
In retrospect, it looks pretty sketchy.
Sketchy for sure, but still not enough to force Shera or any suspect to surrender DNA. So prosecutors sought help from the courts.
We decided that we were going to take a chance on an infrequently used legal tactic by way of a grand jury investigation, and ultimately present the information we had to the grand jury, and then get the court's authorization to compel that person to provide a DNA profile.
The court ruled there was enough probable cause with these 11 men to force them to provide their DNA. Trooper Noah Pack went to tell Gary Shera of the court's decision. Shera wasn't home.
I asked Gary's roommate to let Gary Shera know that the state police had some important paperwork to serve him. I gave his roommate a copy of my business card and said, have him call me.
Shera was found in a nearby hospital after a failed suicide attempt. His DNA matched the DNA recovered from Lisa Ziegert's crime scene.
You're married, you have a child, and you do this to another young woman. What kind of a monster are you?
Forensic technology had progressed a lot during this case. One of the images created by Parabon bore a remarkable resemblance to old photos of Gary Shera.
And when his photo came up on my computer, I thought, well, look at that.
In 2019, Shera pled guilty and was sentenced to life without parole. Investigators believe he'd become fixated with Lisa after buying a music box from the card store, an item later found with his belongings more than 20 years later. Knowing Lisa worked alone, prosecutors believe he waited until no one else was in the store, forced her into a back room, and overpowered her. He got her into his car and took her to the woods, where he assaulted and then killed her. In a twist that still baffles investigators, he apparently never committed another act of criminal violence. But alert detectives knew Lisa's killer had left his genetic calling card behind and made sure that the vital DNA evidence was not destroyed.
So even 20 plus years after the collection of this material and the discovery of Lisa's body, we really had a lot to work with.
I am hoping that Lisa's case will convince people that this is the way to go. This is the way that you can solve this case. Please, use it. And please remember this adorable 5'2", eyes of blue, curly brown hair, young woman who wanted to make a difference in this world. Bright, beautiful, loving human being who made our lives better and continues to.
You're watching HLN On Demand. You're watching HLN On Demand.
Up next,
I remember him hitting my face and saying, I have killed before, and I'm not afraid to kill again.
she survives this attack. Barely. Another woman does.
The crime itself might have been motivated by some kind of a sexual perversion.
He had a thing for anything with legs.
The killer is so close, he's practically family.
But not believe it. Still can't believe it to this day.
He escapes arrest for years, but one clue finally identifies him.
If we got the palm prints of the suspect, we would have the killer. I just didn't know how long it was going to take.
Locals will tell you that the Old West is alive and well in Stephenville, Texas, a small town about 2 hours southwest of Dallas.
We're known to be the cowboy capital of the world. We have a lot of rodeos here, and it's just a quiet little town.
For all of her life, it was home to Susan Woods, who loved the area's go-it-alone attitude.
She was very strong-willed. She didn't want to leave Stephenville for any reason. She wanted to stay there with that steady job and the nighttime shift that she liked, and that's what she wanted. That's where she was.
Susan met Indianapolis native Michael Woods, a professional musician, in 1980. It was a classic case of opposites attract.
This beautiful girl walked through the door, and I saw her, and I immediately started talking to her because she was probably the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. So I had to talk to her.
They married a short time later, but while Susan loved Stephenville, her new husband did not.
I could not stand Stephenville. I got harassed by the police on a regular basis. I was always having some big cowboy say something smart to me, and I'd back him down. Every time. I didn't take crap off of people, and I didn't like their backwater attitudes. I wanted out. I hated Stephenville.
This was too much strain for the marriage to bear, and the couple divorced after 5 years. Susan stayed put in Stephenville. Michael moved home to Indiana, and life went on. Until July 20. This was so out of character that when her father found out, he went straight to her house and came upon a scene of horrific violence.
She was totally nude, slumped over the edge of the bathtub, bent at the waist over the tub, and her face and upper part of her body were submerged in the water.
Oddly, despite clear indications this crime was sexually motivated, there was no evidence of rape. Also, there was no forced entry into the house, and Susan was notorious for keeping her doors locked.
She was terrified of men. She really was. She was very scared of men in general. A guy that she had worked with came by one day to discuss their paycheck, and she would not let him in the door. She opened the window and talked to him through the screen.
Every indication at the scene was that Susan knew her killer, and that led in one direction, to her ex-husband.
Oh yeah, he was the one that jumped up right off the bat in the investigation.
I felt like that Michael had killed her. I just felt like he had.
As Susan and Michael Woods' marriage ended, she shared something shocking with her closest friends. A cassette tape Michael recorded for her and left behind.
The tape was very filthy, vulgar, aggressive. He was very hostile, just very, very mad, bizarre. I was just in a state of shock when I heard all this. I just couldn't believe it.
That tape really caused them to fear that he would be capable of returning and causing trouble for her.
If detectives could find this tape, they'd have something of a smoking gun, but it was not to be.
What we found out afterwards was Susan had taken the tape and had shipped it to Michael. He was going to anger management. He wanted them to have the tape, so we never heard the tape.
So Michael was an ex-husband with anger management issues and a murdered ex-wife. It didn't look good for him.
Everybody in town, everybody who knew anything at all about Susan Woods, swore up and down that Michael either did it or had it done.
Detectives informed him that Susan was dead and told him he was suspect number one.
I was scared. They were talking about putting me in the gas chamber. They said that I was guilty and they knew it, and I didn't see how any of this could be possible. But then the Texas police were involved, and, well, I gotta tell you, I got no great love for the Texas police.
Michael said it happened. Plenty of people saw him.
But he never provided those witnesses. So, after that first interview, that initial interview with Indiana Police Department, he stopped all interviews so they could proceed with him. Or his alibis, they couldn't check him out.
And even though Michael was living more than 1,000 miles away from Texas, investigators said it would be possible for him to commit the murder and get home without leaving a trail.
Back then, there weren't any gas station cameras. If he did it on cash, then, yeah, theoretically, he could have come in, got it done, and left.
As for the cassette tape, Michael admitted recording it and made no apologies.
There were no threats on it. I cursed, I got loud, I was angry. But I never threatened Susan.
Back at the scene of the crime, detectives noticed the toilet seat was up. Something Susan clearly didn't need to do. A partial fingerprint, not from Susan, was lifted from the bathroom mirror. And the living room showed signs of a visitor who seemed comfortable in the house.
Investigators discovered in the living room an ashtray that had 6 cigarette butts in it. I think they found a can of Coke, some potato chips, and I think a couple of cans or used cans of beer. It did look like if somebody had been visiting in the living room, they would have been a casual visitor or a friend or something of that nature.
Detectives assumed the cigarette butts were the killers. Susan didn't smoke and lived alone. The butts were taken into evidence. A partial print was lifted from one of the beer cans. But the key evidence was in the bathroom. The position Susan's body was found in made it appear her killer had shoved her head under the water in the half-filled bathtub.
That's up close and personal. I can only imagine the terror that she was feeling, trying to gasp for breath, for air, trying to at least get her head up enough to get a breath, and knowing that drowning is inevitable. I can't imagine.
Since Susan was fighting back, analysts surmised her killer would have braced himself by pushing his body against her and putting his hands on the rim of the tub to give himself some leverage.
It is suggested that the perpetrator would have had to have positioned himself with his hands on each side of her on the bathtub itself.
And this theory proved to be true. Palm prints were found on the top of the tub, directly to the right and left of Susan's body.
I knew we had prints of the killer. I knew that it would be possible to identify the killer if we ever got a print from him to compare.
If Michael Woods killed his ex-wife, there would be no escaping this evidence.
It was very obvious that whoever left those prints there was the one who had killed Susan.
Of Susan Woods' body, they were confident they would solve her murder. Virtually everyone involved in the investigation believed Susan's ex-husband, Michael, was her killer. Now, it was only a question of getting his palm prints. Detectives had enough probable cause to do it.
They had arrested me, my brother, and a friend of ours that was at the house that took all of our prints. It was just ridiculous. They wanted me because it would have been an easy case to prosecute.
Detectives who thought they had their man were in for a surprise.
They didn't match. So that pretty well eliminated him as the killer.
They were shocked. They were convinced that it was Michael.
It didn't seem to matter to them that they had evidence to the contrary. They had people in Stephenville that were willing to talk very bad about me. And the tales grew taller as they went.
The palm prints were tested against 160 men. There were no matches, and soon there were no more suspects. The case stalled.
I prayed every night to God that before I left this earth, I wanted to know who killed my best friend, Susan.
By 2002, 15 years after Susan's murder, fingerprint and DNA technology had come a long way. A male DNA profile was lifted from the cigarettes left burning in Susan's living room. To be absolutely sure, this profile was tested against Michael Wood's DNA.
And it was not Michael. And I called Michael and I said, Michael, you are not a suspect at all. So you're cleared. He broke down, he started crying, and he said thank you, and he hung up the phone.
I don't remember when or if he said, "You're no longer a suspect." He may have said it a dozen times. I don't know. I was pretty blown away by all this.
The unknown male DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. There were no matches. Nothing happened for years. Then, in 2006, there was an APHIS hit on the partial prints found in Susan's bathroom and on a beer can in the living room. They belonged to a 40-year-old man named Scott Hatley. His prints got into the system after a 1988 robbery.
My first thought is you got the right guy, because I remember the other case I was involved in, and he was capable of doing something like this.
The other case involved a woman named Shannon, who asked us not to use her last name. As a teenager, she dated Scott Hatley.
I was 15, 16, he was 20, 21. So there was a big age. Scott was very controlling when we were dating. He wanted to know where I was at all times, who I was with.
A year after Susan Woods' murder, Shannon had an encounter that would change her life. She had ended her tumultuous relationship with Scott Hatley. She later told police he wanted to rekindle the romance, and she agreed to meet him. She soon realized that getting alone in a car with Hatley was a mistake.
He immediately started pressuring me for sex. I refused. And when I refused, that's when he lost it and started attacking me. He started hitting me, and, I've never been hit before. He was very abusive. He started raping me, and then he would stop and smoke a cigarette, drink his Bacardi, and would continue to rape me. The whole time telling me that I deserved it.
Shannon told police she endured the brutal assault for 8 hours.
I remember him hitting my face and saying, "I have killed before, and I'm not afraid to kill again." When he said that, I was thinking, I'm not going to get out of here alive. I'm going to be his next victim. And that's when I started manipulating him and telling him how much I loved him.
She talked her way out of it. I think she's very lucky to be alive.
I hit my face. I did things that I didn't think, wouldn't have thought, because I was 16, naive. I was so naive at that time.
Alert detectives noticed strange similarities between Shannon's account and Susan Woods' murder. The missing link was whether Scott Hatley had a connection to both of these women, and detectives soon found he did. In 1988, when Scott Hatley was accused of a brutal sexual assault, investigators faced some hurdles. This despite the apparent victim having done all the right things.
We immediately went to the hospital. They did the rape kit, they did everything. They collected so much evidence. I immediately pressed charges.
But a grand jury failed to indict Scott Hatley. In Texas, at that time, male defendants were allowed to present, as evidence, the sexual history of accusers between the ages of 14 and 17. It was known as the promiscuity defense.
When they failed to indict, I felt like no one was listened. That, I felt like a victim again. Not only was Scott's victim, hurt me worse than anything at that time. And still does.
In 2006, Scott Hatley faced another assault accusation.
He had been recently charged in Round Rock with committing a physical assault against his wife in a way that was very similar to the Susan Woods factual situation.
This allowed police to take Hatley into custody. His two prior alleged assaults bore striking similarities to the murder of Susan Woods. All three took place over hours, and Hatley knew all three women. In fact, he was family with Susan Woods' closest friend.
Scott Hatley was my cousin. I grew up with him. He was 6 years younger than me.
When questioned, Scott Hatley denied any involvement.
Did you ever have sex with Susan? No. So there wouldn't be any reason why your DNA would be anywhere around her body? I don't think so.
But but the evidence directly contradicted Scott Hatley. He surrendered his DNA, his palm prints, and his fingerprints. All of it matched back to the crime scene.
There was no doubt in anybody's mind that he was the killer of Susan.
I think he made a move on her, and I think he did try to kill her, but she wasn't going to have none of it. No. She fought. I believe she fought as best she could.
Stephenville was a small town. Hatley would have known of Susan's recent divorce and perhaps thought she was available. To this day, no one knows how he got into her house. But once inside, he apparently subdued Susan in the bedroom and strangled her to near unconsciousness with an electrical cord. Investigators believe this was the start of a lengthy assault. In this case, he left his palm prints on the rim of the bathtub, fingerprints on the bathroom mirror, and on a beer can. This was before anything like touch DNA, and since there was apparently no actual rape, no DNA was found on Susan's body. But Hatley didn't realize he'd left his DNA on cigarette butts, later found in Susan's living room. During the final assault, in the bathroom, Susan fought back, and hard. To subdue her, Hatley had to brace himself against the tub, leaving two nearly perfect palm prints on both sides of her body.
He has a pretty arrogant streak, and he just thought he never would get caught, or didn't think about it. He thought he was bulletproof.
And to a certain end, in a death penalty case, Hatley provided crucial information to prosecutors. That helped his case, and he accepted a plea deal for 30 years in prison for Susan Wood's murder. He served only 11 years of that sentence, released on parole because of a good record behind bars and prison overcrowding.
So even though the nature of the crime would have mitigated against him getting out early, apparently he was a clean prisoner, and everybody in the prison system thought it was time for him to get out, and so they made that call.
Susan's family and friends are outraged her killer is a free man, but are grateful for the evidence that finally exposed him.
Well, I think he's a coward. I think he views women as second-class citizens to be used at his discretion. And I'm sure if he thinks he can keep it quiet or keep it down, he'll try.
I would describe Scott Hatley as a monster. A narcissist monster. He's a very dangerous man walking the streets.
But in the end, the one thing is very, very for sure, and that is Scott Hatley is guilty of this crime and forever will be.
You're watching HLN On Demand. You're watching HLN On Demand.
Up next, a woman has a frightening premonition.
I knew something was coming, but I didn't know it was that.
Within hours, a young mother is missing.
She said goodbye, smile on her face, and that was the best I saw her.
Detectives can find no sign of the missing woman.
We don't have an apparent crime scene. It appeared as if she had just vanished.
Months pass. Then a makeshift coffin rises from the depths and exposes a cold-blooded killer.
When you delve inside his mind, you can find a very evil, evil person.
There's Lori. Say hi, Lori.
In the spring of 2005, Lori Leonard, The 33-year-old single mother of 2 young boys was embarking on a new life. She moved from Syracuse, New York, to the small town of Chittenango, about a half-hour away.
She was determined to give her boys a good life. She wanted them to have a family upbringing, a traditional upbringing, where they go outside and play in the backyard and they have animals and each other.
For a while, Lori and the boys stayed with her sister. She got a job as a bartender and began moving into a new apartment.
She was just ecstatic to be getting her own place, finally getting back on her feet.
On the morning of May 4th, she dropped the boys off at school. Lori was supposed to pick them up the next morning at her sister's house. She never showed up.
I started feeling anxious. I thought, like, what is happening? It was an anxiety attack. I emailed my cousin. I said, I don't know what is wrong with me. Something is happening. I feel it.
Her family called the police. They checked her new apartment. Her car was parked outside.
We obtained a search warrant to look through the apartment. The apartment as a person was in process of moving. There were a lot of boxes still unpacked. Everything looked rather normal.
It did not look like a crime scene. It did look like somebody had just moved into the home.
But there were no sheets on the bed, and there was something else that seemed strange.
It was a female shoe that was located on the bed. It was believed to have been hers. There was no other females that were in the home that were residing there.
And the match to that shoe was nowhere in the...
There wasn't blood anywhere. There wasn't any visible signs of struggle. There's no forced entry to the home. There didn't appear to be any valuables that were missing.
Police across New York State used all the tools at their disposal, both high and low tech, to track her down.
We looked into cell phone usage to try and see if we could locate her by GPS. Also, we started looking at credit cards to see if she was using them somewhere or if they were being used somewhere. So we could go to that specific store, maybe get some video footage, see who's using the cards. There was no activity at all.
Even worse, police were in a bind. There was no actual evidence that a crime had been committed.
We didn't have a body. We had checked local hospitals all over, and they didn't have any Jane Does. They didn't have anybody matching her description. We didn't have any information.
But Lori's family did have some information that concerned detectives. Lori was a single mom looking for love, and a father for her sons.
I know that to complete, her family wanted a good man for the boys in their lives constantly, and that would have completed everything.
She was doing this online. In 2005, a relatively new way to date. Lori's family and police were worried. Perhaps a predator, under the cover of the internet, was hunting for a victim.
That's very risky behavior. Online dating, meeting people on the internet, it's dangerous. The potential of things happening are bad there.
On the day she went missing, Lori Leonard told her family that she was driving 2 hours to Albany to pick up tickets to a New York Yankees baseball game from a man she never named. She met this man during her previous job at an upstate casino.
It was a customer. He must have had something Yankee on, and they struck up a conversation, and he had extra tickets that he wasn't going to be able to use, and did she want them? And she said, absolutely.
Lori and this man were to meet at a hotel in Albany. At the time, her family didn't think this was unusual. Now they had questions, and so did detectives.
There was always a belief that with the tickets, with them meeting at a hotel in Albany, that there was other arrangements and other things going on.
The whole scenario seemed strange. You know, this guy's just giving her free Yankees tickets. She's got to drive a ways away for him. I mean, we didn't know anything about the guy.
This man, a corporate executive, was located after detectives backtracked his emails with Lori. He was married, denied any affair with Lori. There was just one problem. According to him, that meeting never happened.
It said she never showed up, which was horrifying to hear.
He believed that something either happened to her or that she just blew him off and wasn't coming to get the tickets.
Investigators went to the hotel to check out his story.
Hotel video and staff were able to establish that he was there by himself, that nobody else had arrived. There wasn't anybody else.
Now detectives redoubled their efforts with people Lori had contacted via online dating sites.
She had numerous male contacts, and it became quite apparent very fast that there were numerous interviews that had to be conducted to help to locate where she might be.
And, as is common with dating sites, some people use aliases to disguise their true identity.
She's communicating with other people that could have motive, could have information as to where she is.
Weeks turned into months. Then, on the morning of July 24th, 2005, a local fisherman was out on the Champlain Canal, a 60-mile waterway that connects Lake Champlain to New York's Hudson River.
He's going along, and he sees what appears to be a shiny object below the water. Couldn't figure out what it was. He goes over, he retrieves the item, hooks onto it, drags it to shore.
This was clearly no fish. It was a toolbox, about 4 feet long, designed to fit into the bed of a truck.
He believes that it's a good find, that he's found this toolbox, this treasure, and he's going to keep it. So he hauls it to shore, and he cracks it open, and it's not what he thinks it is.
Inside was the badly decomposed body of a young woman.
As they opened the toolbox and they looked in it, eerily enough, there was a casino ID facing up with the name Lori Leonard on it.
A tattoo left no doubt the victim was Lori Leonard.
I remember hearing my grandmother screaming, crying herself to sleep, and she was like the toughest person in the family. Everybody's personality just, switch was hit that day. Yeah, it was rough for everyone.
What was a missing persons case now became a full-fledged homicide investigation.
In all my years as an investigator, I've been involved in numerous homicide investigations. Every one of them is different. I've never seen any cases quite like this one.
When Lori Leonard's body was recovered from the toolbox found, her face was wrapped like a mummy with duct tape.
It was discovered that there was a bandana stuffed in her mouth to more or less suffocate her.
Also in the toolbox was the match to the single shoe that police found on Lori's bed when she disappeared. All this evidence led to the conclusion Lori was subdued, but not necessarily killed, in her apartment.
The cause of death was asphyxiation, and the manner of death was strangulation. Then there was some sexual assault also involved.
Lori's killer clearly thought this metal coffin would ensure her body sank to the bottom of the Champlain Canal. Inside the toolbox were what are called sand tubes.
Those sand tubes are the type of tubes that if you live in snow weather, you'd use as weight you'd place in the back of a vehicle, in the trunk of a vehicle, or in the bed of a truck to help with weight for traction.
Despite the tragedy of actually finding the body, detectives were stunned by how it was found. There was approximately 180 pounds of sand in the toolbox, which itself weighed 50 pounds. Lori was about 100 pounds. That's more than 300 pounds that ultimately floated close to the surface of the water.
I believe it was two variables that happened. The water level itself dropped to a degree, but most of all, as her body was decomposing, it caused gases inside of this airtight toolbox that caused it to rise to the surface, irregardless of the weight that was used to hold it down.
To Lori's grief-stricken family, the piece of evidence that stood out most was the bandana. A man she briefly dated. He had helped her move into her apartment the day she disappeared, wore bandanas all the time.
Every time we saw him, he had a bandana on, different color. He had the goatee, the shaved head, and bandana. And in my mind, it seemed like a wannabe type deal. You know, he wanna be a tough guy.
His name was Sean Doyle. Since he was the last person to see Lori, he'd already been questioned by police.
At the end of May, when we conducted our in-person interview, when he arrived in his bandana and leather coat, that bandana that we photographed him with was the same design and color as the bandana in her mouth.
At the time, this bandana meant nothing to investigators, but it did now, especially after they found Doyle had a history of trouble with women.
He had some arrests for domestic relationships, assault, unlawful imprisonment, possession of weapons. There were some domestic incidents on file.
When it became known he was a possible suspect, one of his neighbors reached out to police.
A large toolbox. He was very proud of it, had just purchased it, didn't have it for very long. And then coincidentally, a short time later, it was no longer on the truck.
This fit the description of the toolbox that served as Lori's coffin. Doyle denied ever owning one, but detectives found he'd bought a toolbox less than a week before Lori went missing.
We were able to connect the dots on where he purchased it, the means that he purchased it, the cashiers remembering him, description, and what he purchased.
The investigation showed Doyle once had a plastic liner in the bed of his truck. Detectives learned that shortly after Lori disappeared, Doyle removed that liner and replaced it with a spray-on liner. Not an uncommon thing to do, but under the circumstances, it was highly suspicious.
A bed liner seals the pickup truck bed, and basically, if there was any forensic evidence in that pickup truck bed prior to it being coated, it would have been lost.
But now, police got another potential break.
We were able to track down the location where he had it done. They had kept the bed liner, and we were able to take that and examine it and collect the evidence. For us, that was remarkable that they still had it.
Hairs consistent with Lori Leonard's hair were found, but detectives had a problem. Doyle used his truck to help Lori move, so of course her hairs would be on his truck liner. If they were going to connect Doyle to Lori's murder, they had to have something more. Sean Doyle was known to Lori Leonard's family and friends. The two dated briefly.
I thought he was a biker wannabe. He was one of those who would just, come around the family, ignore everybody but her, just be on top of her the whole time and not have much to say to anybody else.
But Doyle didn't like that Lori was open to seeing other men.
Lori stopped seeing him because he started getting possessive. She didn't want to hate him, but she didn't want to date him.
And so they remained friendly. And when Lori needed to move, she asked Doyle, who had a truck, to help her. Now with her dead, and with Doyle as her last known contact, he was the chief suspect in her murder. The finding of hairs consistent with Lori's provided a possible connection to Doyle and the murder. Detectives say even duct tape in his house was consistent with duct tape used to wrap Lori's head. The problem was that while this potentially linked Doyle to the murder, none of it conclusively showed he did it. So investigators turned to the sand tubes found with the body.
Many people think of sand as ubiquitous, that all sand is alike. And in actuality, the shape, the base material, the actual mix.
Like many products, bags of sand are tagged with information indicating where it was packaged and when.
Lot numbers or lot codes is what is used for identifying a group of common items and has the information about where, when, and sometimes how it is produced and packaged.
A search of Sean Doyle's property turned up the same brand of sand tubes found with the body. Investigators wanted to see if they could tie the bags from Doyle's garage back to their crime scene and turn to the lot numbers.
When you find matching lot codes, it demonstrates that the products were produced at the same facility and at the same time.
A last clue came from the glove compartment of Doyle's truck. A toolbox key with a serial number. That number was finally tracked down.
After the toolbox was found and all the forensic work was completed, that's when the key came back into play, because the toolbox itself had a matching serial number to that key that was located in Mr. Doyle's truck.
The hairs, the duct tape, the lot numbers on the sand tubes, and finally the key. With little doubt that Doyle was Lori Leonard's killer. In January of 2006, he went to trial on a charge of second-degree murder. One of his ex-girlfriends was called to the stand.
Sean Doyle had apparently became upset at her. He had tied her up, similar fashion to that of Lori. He used bandanas.
Sean's ex-girlfriend's mother, she had heard muffled noises in her basement where her daughter's room was, and the mother had gone downstairs just in time to see that Sean had wrapped duct tape around her mouth and her wrists, and she screamed and he ran out.
A jury found Sean Doyle guilty of Lori's murder, and he got a sentence of 25 years to life.
She's at home.
Lori's sons, now grown men, say Doyle should have been arrested long before he met their mother.
It hurts. It's angering learning that he had done this before and that he should have already been in jail.
Now knowing that there was a record and there were red flags to begin with, it definitely could have been prevented if the right actions were taken, but they weren't, and now obviously my family and us, we have to deal and suffer for it.
Prosecutors believe that Lori going to meet another man at a hotel in Albany could be what set Doyle off. The evidence indicates beating her to death. He bound her wrists and ankles and wrapped her face with duct tape, later linked to his house. He rolled the body up with sheets from inside the apartment. Then he put Lori's body in the toolbox, leaving her hairs in his truck bed as he did so. He weighed the body down with sand tubes, unaware those tubes would later be tied directly to him. And then he dumped Lori in the Champlain Canal, confident all the evidence would sink. But he didn't count on the toolbox being so well sealed that gases from Lori's decomposing body would cause that box to float to the surface and expose him.
My 25-year career, I've seen a lot of tragedy as a policeman. I've seen a lot of incidents where innocent people are hurt, but this is more heinous. This is a story that is very heartbreaking to me personally.
Had he not been arrested for this, who knows who else or how many other victims that there could be. He perfected what he was doing. Each time he did something different and better to improve, which we believe was his ultimate end goal. He made mistakes the first few times, and unfortunately, the others could speak, but Lori could not.
You're watching HLN On Demand. You're watching HLN On Demand.
Up next, a career sailor dies, but not in the line of duty.
To me, it's a waste of a human life.
Teams of doctors can't determine what killed this man.
It could be bacterial, like salmonella or cholera, something of that sort.
Or could it be something entirely unnatural, like murder?
What kind of person does that? How do you do that? Could you? No, I couldn't either.
In 1982, the Cold War was as frigid as ever. U.S. troops were deployed all over the globe. The Navy was perhaps the most visible branch of the service.
The Navy, when they deploy ships during peacetime, it's to just show the United States' presence and interest in various locations where foreign policy is being carried out by the United States.
37-year-old Lee Hartley was a Navy lieutenant aboard the USS Forrestal, America's first supercarrier, and at the time, one of the most formidable warships in the world. Capable of staying at sea for months, it provided cramped quarters for the lieutenant and more than 4,000 fellow sailors.
In its day, the Forrestal was a big modern aircraft carrier.
Lieutenant Hartley was a career Navy man, had risen up steadily through the ranks and loved the work. 1 month into a standard deployment in the Mediterranean, he fell ill.
He's vomiting, he has diarrhea, he has severe stomach cramps. He goes to the clinic on board the ship.
Doctors on board diagnosed a stomach ailment, and soon Lieutenant Hartley was feeling better. But not for long.
They couldn't figure out the cause. They ruled out all infectious causes, other types of tumors and things of that sort, but they couldn't pin it down.
Lieutenant Hartley's condition stabilized, and then he took another turn for the worse.
He would be sick, and then he'd get a little bit better, and then be sick again, and meanwhile the doctors are trying to figure out what's going on.
Things got so bad that he was taken off the ship by helicopter and ended up at a Navy hospital in Florida. Under the care of his wife, Pamela, Lieutenant Hartley continued
huge open sores in his mouth and his esophagus, is in extreme discomfort. On November the 17th, at 4 o'clock in the morning, he basically flatlines.
The next day, he died. An autopsy showed almost every vital organ in his body had sustained significant damage.
Doctor said, you need to look at heavy metal poisoning on this person. And so they took samples, sent them to SmithKline Laboratory. 6 days later, they get the positive results back that they find arsenic in Lee's system.
Arsenic is one of the oldest poisons known to man. It's a metals-based toxin found in all sorts of minerals.
Arsenic is a naturally occurring element in our world. It's found in the ground from geological formations, and it also is found in our water systems. In high levels of arsenic exposure, you have acute poisoning.
In healthy people, the liver filters out the trace amounts of arsenic all of us encounter. But in concentrated doses, it wreaks havoc on the body.
It's basically tasteless, odorless, and it's soluble in liquids. And so it's easy to hide.
And it's readily available. Arsenic is commonly found in rat poison. An analysis of Lee Hartley's organs showed his arsenic levels were over 400 times what's found in a healthy person. It's hard to ingest that much arsenic by accident, which raised all sorts of uncomfortable questions for people trying to determine exactly how Lee Hartley died.
Who has arsenic in their body of that level, unless it's a poisoning of some sort?
Upon learning that Lieutenant Lee Hartley had been killed by a massive dose of arsenic, the Navy sprang into action. If his death was an accident, 4,000 sailors on the USS Forrestal were in danger. If it was a murder, one of those 4,000 could be a killer.
We're trying to figure out in the early stage now, where in the world did the arsenic come from?
His bunkmate was examined, as was the ship. All 60,000 tons of it.
They did an exhaustive search of the ship, and they could not identify any type of arsenic on board the ship.
That meant someone got the arsenic on board, dosed Lieutenant Hartley, and successfully destroyed all signs of it. Not an easy thing to do.
Don't forget, but we had no idea how it got where it was.
The immediate question was simple. Was there anyone on board who might want to kill Lieutenant Hartley? The answer was an unequivocal yes.
There was a report that somebody had written Hartley's a dead man or Lieutenant's a dead man or something of that sort on the ship.
Lieutenant Hartley was in a unique position on the Forrestal. His job was to report all infractions of discipline. It was a thankless task and potentially dangerous.
I much hate to say it. If you are the disciplinary officer on board, it's totally conceivable that somebody might wish you harm. And I'm sure that Lee, like myself and others, probably avoided going out on the weather decks at night.
Lee Hartley told friends he was reluctant to go out on this latest deployment. Why? He'd only been married to Pamela for a year, and many of his shipmates said he desperately missed her.
That was my singular recollection of him at the time, was that he really, really wanted to be home and really missed being home with his wife.
In fact, when he initially fell ill, doctors, who had no idea at the time that he'd ingested a lethal dose of arsenic, wondered if he might be suicidal.
They had actually asked him in the hospital whether or not he was trying to kill himself, and he was telling them that no, he doesn't want to die.
And if he did want to kill himself, why do it in one of the slowest, most painful ways possible? But the possibility of self-harm led to another theory.
I was of the opinion initially that perhaps, in an effort to have himself sent home early from the ship, that he might have started to take something that contained arsenic that would make him sufficiently sick to be able to go home.
But again, his suffering was so extreme that investigators were skeptical about the possibility of self-harm. With no sign of the source of arsenic on the ship, they were stumped.
The investigation had basically gone cold.
That is, until they heard a story about Lieutenant Hartley and another shipmate getting violently ill while on shore leave in Spain, just 3 months before the lieutenant's death.
That's one of the first things you do, of course, is you look at the universe of possibilities. Later on, the universe of possibilities becomes smaller and smaller and smaller.
As Navy Lieutenant Lee Hartley lay dying in a Florida hospital, one of his doctors thought he might have been poisoned. And they saved samples for later analysis.
They'll take specific samples like brain tissue, liver tissue, kidney tissue, lungs, stomach contents.
Arsenic is retained longer in the fingernails and hair than in any other part of the body.
Arsenic is bound in organic matter differently than it is in our body, to where it goes to inorganic stuff. It goes to our keratin, it goes to our nails and our hair, because that's where the high keratin cells are.
And since the arsenic will stay there indefinitely, it can provide a record of exactly when a person ingests arsenic.
Your hair on your head grows about a half an inch a month. So when they do testing, they say take a lock of your hair. You want to take like a pencil's width of hair, 3 inches long. That could give you information for about 6 months. If you test it out at the 3 inch, that's 6 months from the initial exposure.
To create a forensic timeline for when Lieutenant Hartley ingested the arsenic, his hair samples were subjected to a process called atomic absorption spectroscopy. The hair is liquefied in a neutral solution. A radioactive beam is then sent through the samples. How much of this light is able to pass through reveals how much arsenic is present, allowing analysts to trace the rate of ingestion. This showed that Lieutenant Hartley got an initial dose of arsenic while he was 1 month out to sea. And there was a massive spike 1 month later, around the time he was on shore leave, with the rest of the Forrestal crew in Spain. While there, he finally reunited with his wife, Pam.
Pam would have come over with 100 other wives, probably. 100 or 200 wives typically go from port to port if they can afford the flight over, and then they can reunite with their husband for a week if we're in port that long.
During this time in Spain, Pam cooked breakfast for Lieutenant Hartley and another shipmate. Soon, both were sick.
Lee and his crewmate get violently ill, complaining of diarrhea and vomiting. Lee is noted by Pamela to be ashen gray in color. She stays 8 days before returning home from visiting her husband.
Both men returned to the ship. Lee Hartley's crewmate recovered. Lieutenant Hartley did not. At least, not completely. Doctors and investigators wondered if there might be some connection between the lieutenant's wife and his death. The couple had been married for a little more than a years, and had a young daughter who was Pamela's superior.
I know that he was her boss. She was the secretary at his office. That's how I found out. My mom told me that was the secretary.
Adultery is not permissible in the Navy, so Lee and Pam's affair created a problem.
He basically paved the way for her to get out of the Navy after only being in there for 2 years. And once she left the Navy and they could then date, even though he was married, he went and eventually divorced his wife and then married Pamela.
By all accounts, Lieutenant Hartley was besotted with his new wife, who was 10 years his junior.
She was very soft-spoken. It was different from my mom's, you know, the way she would talk to me and stuff, and I think that's why I liked her more.
The post-mortem analysis of the lieutenant's hair left no doubt he got a big dose of arsenic while in Spain with his wife. Could Pam be involved? It was an open question. After all, Lieutenant Hartley suffered his first bout of sickness 1 month after he was at sea, and Pam clearly wasn't on the ship. Even stranger, he had subsequent bouts of illness long after he was with Pam in Spain. And then, once the lieutenant got back to the U.S. and was in Pam's care, hair analysis showed his arsenic levels had nearly quadrupled.
This is the crux of the case. This is where it turns from, okay, maybe she's not the grieving widow. Pam was identified as a logical suspect because she had the most access and the opportunity.
Forensic analysis of Lieutenant Hartley's hair made it clear he got a large dose of arsenic while visiting his wife, Pam, in Spain. Investigators learned that the lieutenant's shipmate, the one who became ill after eating a breakfast prepared by Pam Hartley, was now in good health. So much time had passed that he'd cut his hair and fingernails, eliminating any potential evidence.
One of the obstacles that we had to overcome very rapidly is we don't have a crime scene.
If Pam Hartley poisoned her husband before she met him in Spain, and again after they left, how did she do it? After all, she was thousands of miles away. The answer was hiding in plain sight.
Lo and behold, she had sent care packages to Lee. Maybe some baked goods, little things that people can't find on the ship or whatever, sent to them.
Sailors received these.
Sending him something on the ship. He's ingesting enough that he's getting sick.
Early in the investigation, Pam Hartley had been brought in for questioning and denied any involvement. She even consented to a polygraph and passed.
It does tend to throw a monkey wrench into a homicide investigation if your primary suspect passes a polygraph.
Everything pointed to Pam, but there wasn't enough to charge her. There's no statute of limitations on murder, and nearly 13 years later, in 1995, investigators prepared to re-interview Pam Hartley and other people with even a remote connection to the case.
They went back and interviewed some of the people, including her brother, who's told a different version of the story, what he initially told back in the 80s.
Pam's brother, Fred, dropped a bombshell.
Pretty quickly, he gave her up and said that she had approached him about killing Lee Hartley, and of course he refused.
Investigators could finally make a case. Also, they knew that Lieutenant Hartley's body, he had been buried, not cremated, could be a rich source of evidence. Arsenic should still be in his hair and fingernails. All they had to do was exhume him. It was time to confront Pam.
It seems to me that there would have been nothing to lose at that point. To go ahead and, and have a serious come-to-Jesus type interrogation with her.
Eventually, we do what we call a showdown. When we sit down with the most likely suspect, we want it to be a surprise.
Pam, who was short on money and fighting a substance abuse problem, was told her brother had given her up. Even worse for her, the evidence, 6 feet under the ground, was just waiting to be tested. Faced with an almost certain conviction, she confessed.
Sometimes people want to confess, and they got the feeling that that was true with Pam Hartley.
As for motive, investigators were stunned. Pam said she knew Lee was madly in love with her. He was also jealous and controlling. She wanted out of the marriage, but didn't want to break his heart by getting a divorce.
It's kind of ironic. She said, I loved him so much I didn't want to divorce him. So she kills him.
This was cold-blooded murder, planned and executed over months.
I was numb. I was numb when I found out that my dad had been murdered. I was numb.
The forensic timeline shows Lieutenant Hartley got a care package only weeks into his deployment. He got sick and recovered. Then Pam met him in Spain and dosed him again. He fell ill and recovered. She gave him a care package before he reboarded. The ship arrived in September, and Lieutenant Hartley's condition deteriorated. He was medevaced from the ship and hospitalized in Florida, where Pam continued poisoning him until he died.
I mean, you can't imagine, here's somebody that you cared enough about to marry, and they are willing, over time, to watch you slowly deteriorate to the extent you're slowly wasting away and dying. I mean, what kind of malevolence causes that in a person? I mean, where does that come from?
In 1996, Pam Hartley, 39 years old, pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. She was released after 16 years. She declined to participate in this production. The senselessness of this crime is the one thing all the investigators can agree upon. And they're grateful science finally solved the mystery of what killed Lieutenant Lee Hartley.
It's hard to dispute the science. The manner of death in this would be homicide. So that toxicology played a significant role in establishing that timeline.
The forensics were so important in this case. It wasn't until, one doctor came in and looked at everything that was going on that identified that they needed to start looking for this poison. People probably wonder, well, why didn't she just get a divorce?
You're watching HLN On Demand. You're watching HLN On Demand.
Up next, a desperate woman struggles to survive.
She was trying to get to the phone. Hard to say if that was before or after she was shot.
Police have a solid suspect, but he's got an airtight alibi.
This is not your prototypical killer. We were looking everywhere to try to get to the bottom of this mystery.
The killer knows how to destroy evidence and nearly succeeds.
I've had a number of cases where individuals have tried to obliterate the microscopic marks produced by the barrel. Luckily for forensic scientists, some of these folks don't know what they're doing.
Southern Pennsylvania is dotted with numerous small towns and communities centered around farming and agriculture.
York County, Pennsylvania is right along the border with Maryland, with a history that goes back prior to the Civil War. It has some involvement in the Battle of Gettysburg.
Violent crime is a rarity in the area. So when, on a March afternoon in 2010, a 911 operator got a call with no response on the other end, it was assumed to be an accidental call.
York County 911, dispatcher 65. Hello? Hello?
99% of those turn out to be totally nothing, either a kid playing with a phone or something along those lines. It's nothing that would raise an alarm.
The York County Control hung up the phone and called back and received a busy signal, so that means the line is still open.
The call was from a landline, from the home of a 55-year-old woman named Monica Schmeier. An officer responded to the house, located in a very remote area.
Monica's house is located on the top of a hill. You can only get there through this kind of a winding driveway that gets to the home.
Police arrived, announced their presence, but got no response. The reason became clear shortly after they entered the residence.
So I was the second one on scene. She was on the floor in the living room, and she was obviously deceased. We suspected a gunshot wound to the head, but we weren't 100% sure exactly what was going on.
The victim was identified as Monica Schmeier. Spear was plainly visible. At first, there was no sign of a struggle in the house.
If anything jumped out at the beginning, it was possibly more of a suicidal situation, that it was a possibility she had killed herself. That was the initial thought.
But a quick survey of the scene put that theory to rest. There was no gun in the house. Monica's face was bloody and bruised, indicating she'd been struck in the head. A blood trail across the floor led to her body.
She had blood on the inside of her thighs that were in a pattern consistent with dripping downward into her inner thighs, as well as blood on the soles of her feet and her socks. So at some point in time, she had gotten up from where she had been sitting and bleeding and moved across the floor towards the phone where she was ultimately killed.
In fact, it appeared Monica's last act was to call 911. This provided a vital clue.
The 911 call becomes so important because they can pinpoint exactly when the call was made. 2:52. How does that help them? Well, it helps them narrow down the time of death.
Police were puzzled. No motive for this murder was immediately apparent.
Her purse was found inside the house. There was lots of other personal property. There was cameras and cell phones and TVs and VCRs.
Even stranger, there were a lot of white envelopes all over the room, and they were filled with cash.
Monica had an interesting way of handling cash and paying her bills. She didn't trust banks, so she kept cash in her home whenever she needed it.
If the killer left thousands of dollars behind, murder would seem to be the only motive. But who would want Monica Schmeier dead? It didn't take long to find a suspect.
Experience shows that, somebody's going to kill you. They usually know you, and it's usually someone very close to you.
Monica Schmeier met her husband, John, at medical school in the late 1970s. When they married, she gave up her medical career to be a stay-at-home mom to the couple's 2 daughters. John Schmeier built a successful ophthalmology practice. Life, at least for a while, was good.
According to Monica, John seemed to develop a wandering eye, and when she found out about it, being a Catholic as she was, she didn't want to get a divorce. So she actually stayed with John for a number of years.
Monica eventually consented to a divorce, at least on paper.
In Monica's mind, regardless of what the divorce papers said, they were married and they were until death do they part.
When detectives notified John Schmeier of his ex-wife's execution-style murder, his reaction struck them as more than a little unusual.
It looked more like I'd look up, and there were no tears. He would go from crying to talking, back to crying, back to talking, but there was never a tear.
Schmeier readily admitted he and Monica had issues. He said he wanted to move on from the marriage, but Monica insisted on being part of his life.
He was very frustrated with the divorce, how things were going. It had been drawn out. It had been a couple years since they had split.
And Schmeier was known to complain about this. Friends said that what he found particularly galling was not how much he paid in alimony, but how Monica insisted it be paid.
She didn't trust banks, so John would pay Monica in cash every month. She would set that money aside, apportioning it for her bills. Then she would go back to John, give him that cash back, and he would write the checks to the utilities or others that she owed money to.
Try as he might, Schmeier couldn't free himself from his now ex-wife, but he insisted he had nothing to do with her murder. Police knew, practically to the minute, when that murder happened, and Schmeier said he had an alibi. He was at a local restaurant with a group of friends who called themselves the Orange Shorts Society.
The Orange Shorts Society, which is a group of middle-aged men that get together once a week at a local restaurant, and they would, talk about politics, money, investments, whatever, but they were all well-to-do men.
On the afternoon of Monica's murder, most of the usual group met, and they confirmed John Schmeier was there.
At first blush, it did seem that he had an alibi, but you could still be a hire for murder type situation. There seemed to be enough bad blood there. It would appear that he could gain substantially from her death.
So now investigators turned to what little evidence they had. An autopsy revealed Monica died from a close-range gunshot to the head. A .32 caliber bullet, consistent with the casing found at the scene, was recovered and forensically examined.
The general rifling characteristics list that was populated showed that firearms produced by Colt, Dixon, and Kel-Tec were among the firearms that could have fired this particular specimen.
While the bullet was damaged, it had sufficient markings to match it to the murder weapon, if only that gun could be found.
If you submit a gun or you submit a barrel, then we can go and test fire those and compare them to this particular weapon.
There were possible witnesses to the murder. Even though Monica's house was well off the road, a neighbor saw a man walking in the direction of her house shortly before she made the 911 call. About 20 minutes later, the man appeared again, walking away from Monica's house.
He sees purpose, carrying what he believed to be a white envelope in his hand. Which then, we immediately say, oh, white envelope, white envelope. We had white envelopes at the scene with cash.
The man was described as a white male, approximately 5 feet 9, with a medium build. A second witness said he also saw a man matching that same description, walking up a hill away from Monica's house, and that he drove away in a silver van.
Not a, soccer mom van, not a big box truck, but like a work van, a work-type van parked facing down the hill.
So far, these witness descriptions were all detectives had to identify this man. It couldn't be said for certain if he even had anything to do with Monica's murder, or if he had any ties to Monica's ex-husband.
We'll come up with 15 different ways this thing happened. We gotta find the right one and be able to prove that one. That's sort of the name of the game.
The prime suspect in the murder of Monica Schmeier was a man seen near her home on the day of the murder. Detectives focused on the vehicle the man was driving, a silver full-sized van. The witness who saw the van didn't get a license plate and didn't know the make of the vehicle.
There was no specific markings about it. We found about 50 different silver vans. We had vans, we don't know if we had the van.
Businesses in nearby towns were canvassed. Detectives hoped either man or machine had seen the van.
Everybody has cameras, everybody's, banks and stores and ATMs, and there's cameras everywhere nowadays, so it's a cursory thing for us. We'll check all the video.
A bank in a town about 3 miles from Monica's house captured video of a full-sized silver van heading in the direction of her house about 15 minutes before the murder.
You see that same van twice on the video, once prior to the time of death and once after the time of death, corresponding to the direction of travel as far as to and from the house.
But the video was blurry, and attempts to enhance it were unsuccessful.
There was no way to try to get a license plate or anything along those lines because the camera itself is designed and focused on people entering and exiting the bank, not in the background.
Which put the investigation almost back to square one. Since Monica didn't date, there were no ex or current boyfriends in the picture, and the possibility of this being a random murder was dismissed out of hand.
You just didn't find this house on a whim? This was a house that you had to know was there. We knew we had to find a connection to Monica. We just didn't know what that connection was yet.
Notes, and found something interesting from his initial interviews with friends of Monica's ex-husband, the members of the Orange Shorts Society. On the afternoon of the murder, the group was joined by a young woman named Sarah, who was engaged to be married to one of the members.
I'm going through my notebook and I'm getting to my interview with Sarah. And I'm looking and I'm flipping and I see the name Tim Jacoby at the top of this piece of paper.
Tim Jacoby was the only regular member of the Orange Shorts Society who wasn't present that day.
And I went, oh my gosh. I said, I never really looked into this guy. And I then pull his driver's license photo up. And again, oh my gosh. His height fits, his description fits, everything fits.
Jacoby was 37 years old, a good job as an engineer and didn't appear, at first, to be a cold-blooded killer.
And then as you dug a little deeper, oddly enough, you found that he had this armed robbery history.
I find that he has a prior robbery arrest where he involved a takeover of a jewelry store where he ended up dropping the jewelry as he was fleeing.
Jacoby pleaded no contest and, with no prior criminal history, escaped jail time. Records showed he owned a .32 caliber Kel-Tec semi-automatic pistol.
The bells are going off now because a .32 caliber is what they're looking for. That is the shell casing they found at the scene of the crime.
While Jacoby didn't know Monica, detectives say they had never met. He did know of her through John Schmeier and the Orange Short Society.
I take it to all of our investigators and say, here we go. Tim knows John. So now is this a whole conspiracy that John pays Tim to knock off Monica? So now we're back in full throttle and we're moving ahead.
After weeks of frustration, detectives finally had a possible suspect in the murder of Monica Schmeier. Tim Jacoby fit witness descriptions. He knew where Monica lived, and employment records showed he was driving a company van, a full-sized silver van, just like a witness saw on the day of the murder.
It's the same make, same model, same year, same color, everything. Circumstantially, when you look at it, it's the same van as the one we saw in the video going towards Monica's house at 2:38 and coming back through at 2:59.
A search warrant was executed on Jacoby's home. His live-in fiancée, Sarah, didn't take it well.
She literally threw up. When I was talking to her, she got so worked up, she was hyperventilating and she vomited in a garbage can.
Detectives didn't find a .32 caliber gun, but they did find a .32 caliber Kel barrel would be consistent with the murder weapon. There was one problem. Someone had scoured the inside of the barrel, an apparent attempt to destroy it as a piece of evidence.
These particular marks were probably produced by a hard surface tool that was used to scratch or to actually mark the lands and grooves inside the barrel.
Test bullets were fired through the damaged barrel, but the scratches apparently worked. They prevented a definitive match from being made to the bullet recovered from Monica's autopsy.
The bullets lacked sufficient microscopic marks to render an opinion of an identification.
Detectives now learned that Jacoby often used his parents' nearby farm for target practice. Teams of forensic analysts descended on the property.
We found the boxed Kel-Tec gun. We found the receipt for the Kel-Tec gun. We found ammunition for the Kel-Tec 32.
But still no gun. However, in the area where Jacoby did his target practice, investigators found 4 spent shell casings from a .32 caliber. It was hard to say how long these casings had been there.
Once those particular cartridge cases were cleaned up, the examiner was able to see that these were manufactured by Speer. They were .32 auto caliber. It's the same as the cartridge case that was recovered at the scene of the crime.
In the same way that bullets are made distinctive by the gun that fires them, shell casings also retain tool marks that are unique to a particular weapon. Microscopic markings on the base of the casings were compared under a microscope to the casing recovered from Monica's living room, and they matched.
The opinion that was rendered was that, in fact, all of these cartridge cases were fired from the same firearm.
That definitively tied Tim Jacoby, or at least shell casings on his parents' property, to the fatal bullet. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, but one question remained. Why would he kill someone he didn't even know?
On face value, Tim would not have had any reason to kill Monica, unless hired by John to do so.
Investigators did a deep dive into John Schmeier's financial records, looking for any kind of payment to Jacoby. There was nothing there.
We were unable to substantiate any kind of connection between John, Sarah, and Tim, and then it got to the point where, okay, we've now eliminated John.
Investigators believe Tim Jacoby targeted Monica not for murder, but robbery. He knew there were thousands of dollars of cash laying around her house. After all, his friend John Schmeier complained about it all the time.
I think he listened to the stories. I think he knew about the money. I think he knew about the envelopes.
He parked up the street, entered the house, and pointed the gun at Monica while he tried to scoop up envelopes containing money. But Monica fought back, or tried to run away. Jacoby hit her in the face, knocking her to the ground. As he looked for more envelopes, it appears Monica crawled to the phone and called 911. Jacoby rushed over and shot her in the head. He took several envelopes filled with cash and walked back to the van, where he was seen by Monica's neighbors. He got rid of the gun, but the shell casings left earlier at his makeshift target range matched the single bullet casing next to Monica's body. In October of 2014, Tim Jacoby was convicted of charges including first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Largely because of microscopic tool marks on shell casings he apparently didn't even know were there. Jacoby remains on death row.
This case was definitely a whodunit. And in my 28 years of law enforcement, we didn't really get a whole lot of good whodunits. It took a lot of time and energy to get to the bottom. This was a challenge for our little police department. And luckily and happily, it turned out good.
When we started, we had a 1,000-piece puzzle, and we didn't have the edges done. So, the forensic evidence gave us the edges in the middle, and we were able to put all that whole picture together so that when the jury looked at those puzzle pieces, they didn't see puzzle pieces. They saw the picture on the box.
You're watching HLN On Demand.